This supply chain nightmare, I was telling Rochelle, I was hoping would go away by now, would be gone. It's just different. It's changing, it's evolving. Of course, the pandemic has continued. We're near what we hope is the end, but not quite, not over the hump. And the supply chain is shifting as well because of changes that are occurring geopolitically, are occurring in economies, and occurring in the source country for the bulk of bicycles and e-bikes for the United States in China. And we certainly hope to touch on all of that. Just bear with me for a moment. It normally takes a few minutes to get to the next slide change, and I'm not sure why, because I have to get to the agenda. I can flip it on my script, but keep pushing the button here. Oh, there we go. So today's agenda is going to be slightly different than for those of you that have been to the previous webinars on this topic, primarily because events have shifted a bit. We're going to review the bicycle supply chain in detail, as we've done in the past, but specifically because of the Lunar New Year, we want to explain that. I know many of you are in the bicycle business, have been for years, but the Year of the Tiger, I think, is particularly interesting relative to the supply chain this year. We're going to look at the both new and old risks of having a supply chain that originates in China, and that continues to shift and change, interestingly. We're going to look at a detailed review of the bicycle supply chain itself as separated from the global supply chain and our order and in-transit flow. We're going to look at the reality of inflation and boomflation that's come up recently, and we're going to explain that, and the geopolitics that impact the global supply chain in the world. And that is shifting and changing as well. We're going to look at the consumer demand issues that are changing and evolving, and want to bring more light to that because that's an extremely an important piece of what occurs in the bicycle supply chain. We need to also carefully look at a review and a discussion of consumer demand and what that's doing to the supply chain as we speak. And then we're going to wrap up with a brief touching on the pandemic, the status of the pandemic, and the era of what we call predictable unpredictability. And then we're going to have a Q&A session. And as Rochelle mentioned, please get your questions in. And for anybody that has questions after the webinar, submit them to the NBDA or to my email address, and I will make sure that you get a response post presentation. So welcome to the Year of the Tiger. I've been in the bicycle business in this aspect of it since the 70s. And the American bicycle business has been bound to the Lunar New Year for decades. I know those of you that are on the retail side have heard us in the supply side talk about this, and you may be fully aware of it because you've done some buying yourself. But because February, which is the beginning of the Lunar New Year, has been so important to the bicycle industry, we've also made sure over the last 30 years that we've adjusted all of our buying to the Lunar New Year. Month of February are plant closings, and in many cases, it's employees leaving plants and going to home villages or home provinces. And the flow of goods, we're very aware, stops during the Lunar New Year and takes a while to ramp up, particularly after the New Year's celebration. So what that looks like from a calendar standpoint is the Lunar New Year 2022 started 31 January and continued to 6 February for a whole week. Plants were shut down, product didn't flow, goods didn't move to ports, shipments didn't move from ports to ships, from ships to destinations. Everything in the bike world stopped, as it has on Lunar New Year for 30, 40 years. So we're very used to it. We plan for it. What the ports had looked forward to, because this affects everything that occurs in Southeast Asia, what the ports had looked forward to is a breathing space. Ports of LA, Long Beach, Seattle, Portland, you name it, Charleston, all the ports were looking forward to Chinese New Year, to the Lunar New Year, because it meant that there would be a week or more where they would not receive goods from China, which is the primary source country for consumer goods and industrial goods coming into the United States. Now, in addition to the Lunar New Year, we also had some other things occurring geopolitically and specifically in China itself. Now, I know this is the same calendar, but the Winter Olympics in Beijing, or close to Beijing, ran from February 4 through the 20th. They just ended this past Sunday. Now, while they were not going to close plants, they also had an impact on a lot of the area around Beijing where some bicycles are made, and out to some other ports and provinces because of COVID and the COVID policies. So there was a general concern during the Olympics that we would see some additional plant closures or restrictions on the employees of the plants that went home during the week of Chinese New Year and simply would get caught in lockdowns during the Olympics and would not be able to return to work during the period up through the 20th. That did not occur in great measure. There was only some of that occurring. But this year, the Lunar New Year was itself important because the Chinese government also made sure that many plants did not allow workers to go home. They had to stay in the dormitories around the plants during the 1 week Chinese New Year, and they could not travel home because last year when they traveled home, the government in turn extended the Chinese New Year and also then locked down movement, and people could not leave home villages to come back to plants. That did not occur this year, but it was one of the possibilities that was being planned for. Overall, the supply community and particularly the logistics community got a week to 2 weeks when they weren't under pressure of Chinese import coming in because the plants simply were shut down and there was no container ships coming from the ports to the United States ports. Now, I mentioned new and old risks in China. This is one of the old risks, the Chinese energy crisis. I know it hasn't made the papers lately, but keep in mind that because of geopolitical issues and considerations, the supply chain nightmare, the supply chain logistics problems of getting goods into the United States has not been in the news cycle, starting with Chinese New Year and over the next 2 weeks for some obvious reasons. So it hasn't been high visibility. What's occurred here is this is one of the old risks. It has continued from the standpoint of sporadic power outages that are affecting manufacturing plants as we go into the year of the tiger. So this map of the power shortages is still valid short term. We're hoping that it's no longer going to be an issue as we get out of the first quarter of this year and get into the second quarter. But right now, there's still been some sporadic plant closure because of the rolling power shortages. And you remember I've explained this before, that it doesn't mean necessarily that the plants can't produce the power. It's that the bureaucrats in charge of production and power plants and all of the energy issues in mainland China got behind in the pledge that the country made to quit using coal-fired plants and reduce pollutants. And now they're catching up. And one of the ways they're catching up is just arbitrarily shutting down coal-fired plants that produce electricity. So what this map shows is all of the colored in provinces of China are those where there have been rolling periodic limited electricity use. And we have on the right-hand side identified the provinces and the one municipality near Beijing where bicycle and bicycle component production is large, looms large, and these are large production centers for our business. So as we follow those, you'll notice most of them are along the coast. And by the way, just for clarification, this is Hong Kong Harbor. So this is Guangdong Province, Hong Kong, and Shenzhen. You've got bicycle production all the way up along the coast. Now, the Formosa or the Taiwanese bike industry is located right here. It's across from the Fujian province. And so what we've seen is a continuation of this is one of the old risks. Again, we think this is one that will probably abate and will no longer be a problem as we get into Q2, but we'll have to monitor it. We'll report on it in the April 19 webinar, which hopefully be a wrap up of what's called the supply chain and logistics nightmare, and we'll move on to some other piece that we'll have to cover relative to the supply chain. Now, I mentioned that things have evolved and changed. This is a piece from February 14th, fairly recently. It's from the Wall Street Journal, from the logistics report. And what it's pointing out is that the global supply chains that have resisted the impact of the fast spreading, I'm quoting here, the fast spreading COVID-19 Omicron variant face new risks in China. What do they mean by that? Well, the Chinese government has maintained its zero COVID policy so that it requires strict lockdowns when local outbreaks occur. We've already seen this in major cities of millions of people and also production facilities and port facilities. And so as the rest of the world begins to take a look at easing restriction, the Chinese government, the major source of production of e-bikes and bicycles for the United States market, has maintained its zero tolerance policy. And that's now looked at as a potential risk facing those of us doing business in mainland China. So with that said, here's a map from January 13th, which was the earliest we could find, by the way, that shows the major cities that have either been locked down or are moving toward lockdown because they're considered COVID-19 risky or risks. Some of these are bicycle manufacturing centers, but they are port centers. Shenzhen, Hong Kong is the little black spot that is below that. Shanghai, Ningpo. So some of the ports are affected, but also some of the bicycle manufacturing and component manufacturing centers. Again, going to the new risks associated with the zero tolerance policy that very well may impact the flow of bicycle products manufacturing wise, while the rest of the world is opening up a bit and the markets are continuing to demand product. Now, this is just, we're closing out the new and old risks of China with this, but I found this extremely interesting. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York, one of the Federal Reserve banks in this country, has developed a global supply chain pressure index. It's put a bunch of pieces together to determine the pressure on the global supply chain, particularly coming into the US. And what it shows is a shrink in recent months. If you go off to the far right, that's 2022, way down at the bottom. I'll show you with my cursor. And then you can see that there's been a decline in what the Federal Reserve refers to as the Global Supply Chain Pressure Index. So this indicates some easing in the overall problems of the supply chain. And all we're pointing out is that the Federal Reserve has a really good reason to try to put the index together and follow this. We're going to see some bumps and grinds and some ups and downs relative to what people are referring to. You bike shop owners are going to see it upfront and personal relative to the supply of new bicycle availability and new e-bike availability for your markets. Now, we're moving to the bicycle supply chain, the order and forecast flow here. You've seen this chart before if you've been following this series. It is an accurate depiction of the US bicycle supply chain that includes bicycle and e-bikes. and additionally shows the order and forecast flow in the bottom. So from left to right is the flow of product after an order is placed, after forecasts and orders are placed. Down below at the bottom, we have forecasts, which are regularly moving from the brands, manufacturers, in some cases retailers, although we understand that the supply side in the US is not asking dealers for as much in forecast information as they used to pre-COVID. And then the orders that follow the forecasts. These are firm orders moving through the process, getting into scheduling so the OEMs can move forward with production, but they have forecast and placed orders in their schedules for raw material and components that come into the plants based on forecasts in order to then meet the firm orders that are placed as the forecasts are turned over to purchase orders and commitments to pay for the merchandise and have it shipped. But this shows all of the steps from raw material, components, to the OEM plants, containerization of bicycles and e-bikes, the movement primarily by truck, maybe all by truck in Southeast Asia to the ports, the Asian ports to the container ships, to the American ports where they're unloaded, put again on trucks, and in some cases rail cars, move to the fulfillment and distribution warehouses that are in our network for all of our channels of distribution, or the brand warehouses. Then in turn, shipping out to bike shops, and from bike shops, the delivery either in person or via a service to the consumer's door or workplace, and then finally to the consumer that is ordered and is demanding the product. It is consumer demand, we will point out, that drives the forecasts, and consumer demand that drives the orders, that in turn drives the whole of the supply chain process. Now, we've talked about this before. At the end of 2020, Dr. Brent D. Williams, who I introduced to you 2 months ago, published an article titled "Slow Pedaling: How the Pandemic Affects Bicycle Supply Chains Now and Later." Now, Dr. Williams is Associate Dean for Executive Education and Outreach and Carson Endowment Chair in Supply Chain Management at Walton College, University of Arkansas. He's also an avid mountain biker. Now, he references rationing and shortage gaming as one cause of the bullwhip effect. The bullwhip effect shown here is pretty much as it graphically lays out. A consumer comes into a shop, can't get a product, goes to the next shop, can't get a product that is demanding. The dealers in those shops, however, go to the suppliers and say, hey, consumers have been in here looking for, I would like to order. And the example they're using here is the consumer demand at retail generates orders for 10 units. That moves on from the retailer who says, okay, 10, I'll get 15, so I've got safety stock. They order from a distributor who looks at the orders coming in from the retailers and orders 20 units to fulfill that. And then in turn, it moves out to the manufacturer, who may order componentry and plan production for 40 units and so on. The bullwhip effect is it starts with the handle of the whip here with the consumer, and then it's an exaggeration of the order quantity all the way out through the manufacturer. And that's specifically what Dr. Williams has studied. And so when he talks rationing and shortage gaming, he's looking at the idea that when faced with known shortages, retailers, bike shops, may game the system by placing inflated orders. Do you think that happens? Could be. While it might seem logical to retailers, shortage gaming can create future supply chain problems. As Dr. Williams points out, if brands and manufacturers view the orders from retailers as real, demand then may overproduce, leading to excess inventory in the supply chain, causing brands and or retailers to hold too much inventory. Now, brands can control gaming by allocating inventory as it becomes available. Some of that we've seen in the market. However, both the retailer and the brands will make forecast sales problems or have problems and make mistakes as they move forward, because brands and manufacturers use sales history to forecast future demand and to plan their capacity according to that. But the sales history from 2019, 2020, and 2021 is highly likely to create problems because of its inaccuracies. And the problems will be for the retailers, brands, manufacturers, and even factories, OEMs, to predict sales as they go forward. Now, this we have shown previously. This is a November 30th article in the New York Times about Megan Seaforth, who owns two running shops actually in two towns in Connecticut. And it points out that the supply chain problems that she's seen have her as a small retailer gambling on hoarding, as the New York Times called it back in November. Subheadline, some independent stores ordered in bulk well in advance and now are hoping they're able to sell what they have. That we submit is the situation not just in running, but also in many, especially bicycle retailers or bike shops. What Megan said is it's placing a big bet and anticipating that what all the analysts are saying is correct. Well, I will point out not every analyst in the bike business said stock up on inventory, but she goes on to say that usually we get through the New York Marathon and then we stop buying shoes. We sell off what we have and go into January super lean. But we're being told not to do that this year because there's going to be a shortage. There aren't going to be any shoes. The buildup of running shoes in Connecticut, where shops are, is just one example of how supply chain woes and pandemic retail shortages are affecting thousands of small businesses around the United States across the fourth quarter of 2021 into the first quarter of 2022, including the bicycle business. Now, this from the Financial Times. Again, we've shown this in the past. This is from December 20th. Supply chains, companies shift from just in time to just in case. And this whole idea of banking up inventory has been talked about as being, it's okay. It's okay because we need to make sure that we're anticipating the shortages and we're meeting consumer demand. Back pre-pandemic, pre-COVID, this is what the supply chain was from the time we placed a firm order to the time we got goods. So the pre-COVID order lead time from a brand placing a purchase order for bicycles and e-bikes was 40 to 45 days. Now, they had done a forecast, they'd placed the forecast in, they'd adjusted the forecast because there's rules where you could do that with the OEMs. They had followed it with a firm order. So from the time the firm order button was pushed, for decades, the lead time for me to push the button to order bicycles and then have them show up at my warehouse was 40 to 45 days. What this shows is the change in order lead time. And for bicycles, this is the average time ocean cargo takes from exporter's gate in China or Vietnam or Cambodia to destination port in the United States. And this is the trans-Pacific eastbounds. Pre-Lunar New Year, this had pushed up beyond 100 days. Remember, it was 40 to 45. Now it's eased some because of the Lunar New Year, but still we're dealing with 80 to 90 days instead of 40 to 45 days for a shipment of bicycles or e-bikes to get from the manufacturing plant in China primarily to a port in the United States so that it can be unloaded and then in turn brought to the distribution center and redistributed to the dealer, to the bike shop, to you guys. So what you see here is the current situation at the end of December 2021 and certainly going into February 2022, going into the new year of the tiger. Now, we continue to receive reports that component inventories are building at OEM factories throughout Asia. And that's for the components they can get, because there's still some components with 300 to 500-day lead times. The finished goods supply chain is full of bicycles. We still get reports that that's building. It's full of bicycles and e-bikes. And inventories are continuing to build at brand and retail warehouses, including fulfillment centers. That's for the direct-to-consumer sellers. And inventory continues to build at retail chains and at bike shops. Now, this is exactly the same report we gave at the last webinar 60 days ago. Now, this is a quote from the director of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Center for Transportation and Logistics, and it quotes his book. But the quote is, for now, companies are building inventories to meet strong consumer demand. Over-ordering of parts and finished goods is rife. And by the way, as I've said, in our industry, it was kind of like, okay, we can. And the impact going on with the quote is spreading through supply chains. This trend will halt when demand collapses, as it inevitably will, and companies will be saddled with bloated inventories. Now, this is coming to the fore now as there's a realization that we might have been too quick to critique and criticize and walk away from just in time. And to be clear here, just in time has been the watchword of the Taiwanese and associated Chinese bicycle and e-bike supply chain pre-pandemic. And it's been recently challenged, as we're well aware. We saw the headlines, by the JIC scenarios, the just-in-case scenarios. However, I've pointed out in previous webinars that despite the consumer demand, despite the shortages, the math, the accounting math that underlies JIT, just in time, is still valid. But there are articles out now that go to the issue that just in time as a strategy goes beyond just the supply chain or the flow of goods. You know, the idea that it comes in just when you need it today to manufacture that product. It also is interwoven in quality assurance. Deming's whole philosophy of just in time was a quality assurance, and still is a quality assurance discipline for manufacturing. It relies on statistical process control all the way down the supply chain. It means that you get better quality product with higher reliability, with less defect, with less chance of a problem. And while the just in case scenarios didn't necessarily abrogate that or make all that go away, it was a challenge. But what's coming forward now is that let's not be too quick to move away from just in time, because it is, as it says here, it's a strategy that is the linchpin of many supply chains. And even though it's coming under scrutiny at this point, it really simply needs to be defined, redefined, and developed and evolved for this market that we are in. Now we're turning to inflation, boomflation, and geopolitics. And this goes back to the last webinar. This is November 10, 2021. And so I wanted to point this out, that back then we were reporting a 31-year high in the month of October as consumer prices jumped 6.2%. This is a recent posting from Bloomberg, and date-wise, this is very current. This covers the month of January. This was published this month by Bloomberg. And what it looks at is inflation from 1981 to 2020 and into 2022, which is out to the far right. It's looking at January 2022 at 7.3%, which, by the way, goes back to the highest it's been in 30 years. The core estimate of inflation at 5.9 eliminates automobile sales and gas. I'm mostly gasoline, but automobiles are taken out of it as well to get to the 5.9. So what I'm pointing out is that this is the highest inflation rate in January that we have seen in 30 years. So it continues: October, November, December, January. This map, which was also published by Bloomberg, shows the variance in inflation rate from the West Coast to the East Coast. What you're seeing here is 6.66 to 6.6% inflation in light blue. Darker blue is 6.6 to 7.1, and so on. The dark brown is 7.5 to 8%, which is the middle of the country and the bulk of the states. The highest rates of inflation are at 8.5 to 9%, and that's in the western states. So if you're interested in this map, it certainly will come with the webinar, but this gives you a current look through February this month of where inflation is the highest in the United States, and conversely, where it is the lowest. This, I think, is important for you to understand from the standpoint of the price increases both that you have received, and what you're going to have to do relative to making sure that you're passing on those inflationary price increases to your consumers. Now, boom, B-O-O-M, inflation. This is from Marketplace, if any of you follow it, from February 16th, fairly current. The word of the day is boomflation. This also has shown up throughout the Wall Street Journal in its economic reporting in the past 2 weeks, also in the past week in Bloomberg. So what it's saying is, forget stagflation. Retail sales point to a boomflation economy. What's going on here? Well, as I'll explain, normally what occurs when inflation starting back in October is the highest in 30 years, running all the way through this month in February, or the report for January at the highest it's ever been, because it keeps improving, it keeps going up, 6.5, 7.5. You see in parts of the country at 9%. Normally what you have is consumers then back off, and consumer buying begins to recede. It cools. Well, that's not happening at this point. Boomflation refers to the fact that inflation is going up and consumer sales are going up. Now, I will point out that not necessarily in the bike business, because what many of you are saying right now is, oh, this is not my shop. I'm not getting consumers in. I'm not getting anywhere near the footfalls that I've had in the past. I'm certainly not selling the number of bikes. And for many of you, service work has gone from, you could have it in a week or 2 or 3 weeks or a month, to you could have it today. We'll do it right now for you. So what does this mean? And we'll get into that. The geopolitics is also a factor relative to the economy, but also in background for what's occurring relative to the consumer continuing to buy. Probably the biggest thing, this is February 19th, this is current, not yesterday or today's news, but current. The Ukraine crisis is looming, being reported by all the news media. As I mentioned, the supply chain shortage has pretty well receded in the background of the news cycle because of news like this, which is important to understand. This would affect, certainly as a crisis, shipping. It's going to affect the supply chains. It isn't at that point yet, but it should be also affecting consumer demand. What it is affecting consumer attitude and consumer confidence, but has not yet translated to any kind of slowing in consumer demand for goods, which you could take a look at here. Now, this again is repeated from last month, the last report 60 days ago, but it's very clear what it's pointing out, and that is that the cargo being handled, the goods coming into the ports, is at an all-time high. That continues to the present. On November 8th, the Sourcing Journal reported retail cargo imports near record pace despite port congestion. And what that's being driven by, these are 2 charts you've seen before, is pre-COVID is to the left, January 2019. Moving over to the pandemic starting and the COVID hitting, January 2020, it actually hit us in March. You see the deep depression in consumer spending, retail spending. And then consumers in the midst of the COVID, started to spend, particularly online. Now, there are two waves here. The lighter one is the US spending. The darker one is the OECD. The OECD is the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. So it's a basket of many countries. The point is that consumers started to buy during the pandemic. They started to buy online, by the way, as a preferred methodology. And in the US, it kept going up and up and up. Shoppers also changed the way in which they spent money and bought things. And that is the shift from spending on services to goods, to hard stuff, and doing that online again. I'll repeat. So what you've got here is the bottom line is spending on services, which declined and stays down, although it's starting to come back. It is a factor that is beginning to grow again. The middle line, or the blue line, is all spending, the combination of both. The light line at the top, or the beige line at the top, is spending on goods as opposed to services. So during the pandemic, consumers started to buy. They shifted from services, going out to eat, going to the movies, going to an entertainment venue, to spending on goods, bicycles, fitness equipment, you name it. And in turn, they did that shopping and spending online. So consumers shifted the way in which they buy. Now, again, I've shown this in the past. The supply chain has a problem. This nightmare comes from the fact that the consumer's demand, and you've got about 25 million shipping containers in the system, some being added, but not many. You've got 6,000 container ships, and that plying the world, and that has stayed about the same. Many of those ships, as we pointed out, have been moved from other routes to the United States because the US remains the highest consumer purchasing market in the world. And the backups, the backlogs, the problems occur when too many of those shipping containers loaded with goods get stuck in ports like Port of LA that we're seeing from this aerial view, waiting for transportation. And in turn, too many of the container ships, the 6,000 ships, are waiting in line to offload goods or get merchandise at these ports. And that's been the continuing saga. The shortages are caused not by the lack of containers per se, but by the lack of containers available in Asia to ship goods to the US and to unload here to have those goods flow to the consumer. Now, what's happened is driving inflation relative to those backlogs, as we pointed out in the past, is costs have gone up. This is the port problems relative to freight rates from Asia to the United States from the fourth quarter of 2020 to the fourth quarter of 2021. And this is $5,000, $10,000, $15,000, $20,000. Take a look at the blue line, China to the United States. And at the time we looked at this in the fourth quarter of 2021, it was $20,000 for a container that had previously cost below $5,000 to ship from Asia. The typical rates could go as low as $1,400 on contracts. They were down as low as $4,000. What this represents, and we reported 60 days ago that there was some easing in those rates, those container rates. Well, there was easing in rates primarily from the United States to Asia. And a lot of that was in getting containers back to Asia to load up with merchandise to ship to the United States. So those containers contain rag, they contain corrugated, they contain low-cost goods, but the rates for a container to ship from the West Coast of the United States to China dropped below $2,000 in some cases, while the rates from China to the United States, this is January 12th. The average price per 40-foot container from Asia to the US West Coast transport over the past week is a 16% increase from the previous week, 169% higher than the same week a year ago, $14,500 $1,272. So while it changed a bit, the cargo ships are costing, the cargo containers are costing the bicycle industry shippers about as much as they did 3 months ago, 4 months ago. This is an average rate, but the point is it's 16% over higher than the previous week and 169% higher than the same week a year ago. And then you could take that all the way back to what they were paying pre-COVID. So this is all going into the cost of goods. It's all going into the inflationary spiral that we're seeing as prices increase. And waiting boxes. The box refers to a container, a 20-foot container, a 40-foot container. The monthly share of imported containers at the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach waiting longer than 5 days for handling. As of February 7th, waiting longer than 5 days for handling. And this is fairly easy. This is 50% of the import containers at the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. Slightly below, if we look at the current period, that are waited in the ports of Long Beach and Los Angeles for more than 5 days to get unloaded, handled, put on a case on a truck so that they could pull them out of the port and take them to a warehouse. Part of this goes to something that has not changed. And because the container ships, container lines can get these high prices, $14,500 per container full of bicycles and e-bikes, they're loading more containers on these container ships than they ever have. We've shown you charts in the past, I'm not going to repeat them, that show up to 70% more going into the port of Los Angeles. What I mean by that is 70% more containers as a top load on a ship coming into the port because they can get more for them. That also takes up more containers, obviously. So the ports having problems handling all the containers is not just the volume of ships, it's also the volume of containers on the ships. And that has led, this is February 7th, to the container shipping lines drawing some harsh scrutiny from lawmakers and regulators. We've reported on this on the past. We don't think this is nearly enough, nor will be nearly enough, but there is pressure being put on the container lines from the government in the United States. There are 2 senators who have now introduced measures to tighten up across the board, to look carefully into whether there's price gouging here. And part of the reason for that is what I'm going to show you next. Again, you've seen this before. This is from the Wall Street Journal Logistics Report, December 2nd. $37.24 billion, $37.24 billion US. The combined operating profit for container shipping lines worldwide in the third quarter of last year, which is nearly equal to the entire combined operating earnings for the carriers for these same container ships and container lines from 2010 to 2020. I'll let that sink in. In one quarter, the operating profit exceeded what these same companies had made over 10 years from 2010 to 2020. Now, I'm not going to bore you with what they're doing with the money, but from the standpoint of the cost of a container today, it's the same steamships. There's a slight difference in the cost of the bunker they use to burn because they're at this point not really that ecologically friendly. The crews are costing a little more, but basically the cost to a container ship operator has not gone up anywhere near what they're charging for the cost of containers to get them from China to the United States. Now, let's move on to demand and what the consumer wants, which is the key here, and when they want it. Because this is from the Bank of America's chief. We used this last report. This is from December 14th. The head of Bank of America says, look, I've never seen consumer spending at a faster rate ever. And so we expected that with inflation to begin to come down. When it was reported This I like to show because it shows the bicycle business, and this comes from a report from the Wall Street Journal. But the whole point here is Kent International, the only full assembler of any size in the United States, reported that they, because of the inflationary pressure, have had to raise prices, and the shortages drove up prices in the US by as much as 54% in September through compared to 2019. Prices went up 54% for bicycle assembly in the United States in September compared to 2019. So this is part of the price increases that you guys have seen at retail. I believe there were 3 to 4 price increases in 2020. There were 3 to 4 price increases in 2021. There's also been the latest price increase, which I understand one of the big three put in place this month. So the price increases continue because of the inflationary push. In the case of Kent International, they report as much as a 54% increase in their operating costs compared to the pre-COVID period. I wanted to put this in simply to say, look, there's a lot of talk about going from the pandemic to the endemic stage, where the COVID-19 is going to be treated like the flu. And the state of California has already declared that. They've said we're moving from pandemic to endemic, the largest state in the union. And that's an important move, an important shift, but be aware that this is February 21, that there's still a concern because there's a more contagious version of Omicron, and it's spreading across the US. And this is from an NPR news bulletin that it's called BA.12. I don't know why there's 2 points in there, by the way, but BA.12. It's a variant that spreads about 30% more easily. And it's the cause of concern because right now, the experts are worried that this may flare up and become another hit relative to the spread of the coronavirus through this new variant of the Omicron. However, to date, there has been no such surge. And so now the question of whether these rollbacks are going to continue and be with us, and this is going to be the beginnings of opening up both for retail, for bike shops, for selling of anything and everything. Still, you got to be a little bit cautious. Don't jump yet. Watch it carefully and just use a little caution, and we'll see where we are 60 days down the road, April 19th. So I'm into final statements here before we go to Q&A. And this is from Saturday, February 19th. It's from Bloomberg. It's called their Weekend Reading. Comes out on the weekend. It's got some interesting things in it. I just wanted to point out one piece that I have blown up from the top of this. America's consumption boom is still running at full throttle, with retail sales surging in January by the most in 10 months. I said before that when you've got an inflationary period like this, where we're seeing inflation that's the highest it's been in 30 years, typically there's a cooling of consumer spending. You saw what the president or the head of one of the largest banks in the country said just at the Christmas period time, the end of last year. This is the current situation. America's consumers are continuing to buy. They're going full out, and retail sales surged in January by the most in 10 months at the same time that inflation surged at the most in 30 years. So the spike highlights a steady appetite of merchandise, such as cars and furniture, and might suggest consumers are buying big ticket items before interest rate rises. Keep in mind that the geopolitical news has completely dominated the news cycle, but prior to that, one of the things that was picking up a lot of coverage was the Federal Reserve meets in March, and the speculation in all the news media was how many rate increases this year. Now, they haven't made any yet. They're not going to make any until March. But yet there was speculation that, oh, there'll be 3, there'll be 5, there'll be 7. Every time the speculation came out, the stock market quivered. And so there was an impact and an effect on the economy. More importantly to what we're talking about is there was a lowering of consumer confidence, which is another set of indexes. But what we're seeing here is counter to all that. America's consumption boom is still running full throttle. So with that said, I'll wrap up with the NBDA bicycle buying consumer research study. It was done in November, finished just before Christmas. It's available now for suppliers at $5,000. This was 2,500 American adult bicycle users and riders. And the survey itself is timely. It did make some really, really interesting findings relative to the number of new cyclists that came into cycling to ride bikes that had never ridden before, the number that came back that had dropped out of cycling, and also how e-bikes were bought and how they will be used and how they will be purchased and how all bicycles will be used. So at $5,000 for consumers, or I'm sorry, for suppliers, this is hundreds of PowerPoint slides and hundreds of pages that are available from the standpoint of information and data. For dealers, the NBDA has boiled this down to 60 pages at $399 for dealer members of the NBDA and $699 for non-retail members of the NBDA. And I think this goes to many of the answering many of the questions about where's the consumer going, what's their mindset, more importantly, when are they going to buy, which goes to part of the explanation for why footfalls are down in bike shops at this point in time, why we're building up too much inventory in the opinion of many experts now, and also what we're going to need to do in the future. So in summary, we went through the supply chain and logistics of the year of the tiger. We looked at the new and old risks in China, and there's some we haven't covered yet because that's a whole geopolitical discussion. We looked at the bicycle supply chain, the order and in-transit flow. We looked at inflation, boomflation, and geopolitics. We looked at the demand and what the consumer wants and when they want it. We looked at the Omicron variant briefly in the era of predictable unpredictability. And it's time for question and answers. And we've got about 6 minutes. And what I'm going to do is put my contact information up. And Rochelle, have we got any questions from the 7 participants?
While we're waiting for any questions that might come in, I would like to thank you, Jay, for being on here and for sharing. And thank you for sharing out that consumer research report. We're really excited about it. You're right, it does answer a lot of questions that we get coming in. But also, if you have questions about this presentation, anyone that's watching on the recording, please email Jay. His email is directly on screen, or you can email the NBDA at info@nbda.com, and we'll pass on any questions and make sure they all get answered. I don't see any coming in live, Jay, so we might just chalk it up to a very thorough presentation and wait to see if anybody has questions when they're watching the recording.
Okay, excellent. Thank you.
Thank you, Jay. Thanks everyone for being here. Have a great day.
Bye.